Good morning, everybody. Happy New Year. Welcome to Pediatric Grand Rounds. Thanks, everyone who's in the room with us today and those of you who are joining us by WebEx. Just the usual reminders for our WebEx folks. If you have questions or comments for our speaker at any time, you can type them into the chat with everyone box. I will see them and I will read them out at the end of the presentation. I get to turn things over today to Dr. Jason Dean, who's going to introduce our speaker for today. Thank you.
Kinixikoi, Natanako, Jason Dean, Namototo, Skapi Pikuni. Just as a quick acknowledgement, we are in Coast Salish land here. So I'm very honored on behalf of the UW Pediatrics and the Center for Indigenous Health to welcome Dr. Allison Empey as our inaugural visiting Native professor. She's a citizen of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. She's an associate professor in the Division of General Pediatrics at OHSU, where she also serves as vice chair for equity, diversity, and inclusion in the Department of Pediatrics. Dr. Empey's research focus is creating and evaluating pathways to diversify the medical workforce, specifically focused on Indigenous students. In the Northwest Native American Center of Excellence at OHSU, she addresses the underrepresentation of Indigenous people in healthcare by directing the Y-East Medicine Post-Baccalaureate Program, which is a very innovative post-baccalaureate program for Indigenous pre-med students. Her professional interest includes Indigenous child health, community engagement, newborn care, mentorship for URM trainees in healthcare. She chaired the American Academy of Pediatrics Committee on Native American Child Health from 2020 to 2024, and was integral in the Supreme Court lobbying efforts to uphold ICWA protections, and that's what we're going to learn about today. For recognition of her work, she received the 2024 inaugural Academic Pediatric Association Award for Transformational Leaders, the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Award. She's indeed a transformational leader in Indigenous child health, so please join me in welcoming Dr. Empey.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I'm really excited and honored to be here today with so many of my colleagues and friends from residency, but many of my colleagues that I've actually done some of this work with today here at Seattle. So my title today is Understanding the Child Welfare Act, Celebrating Resiliency and Sovereignty. And I just wanted to take a moment to thank Jason for the land acknowledgement today. And really, there's this movement to move beyond the land acknowledgements, and by inviting me here today, and then I've also learned about so many wonderful programs that exist here at Seattle Children's, as well as at UW, and community partnerships that you have. So thank you for that. This is my normal land acknowledgement that I do up at OHSU, and that is Y-East, or Mount Hood, there in the background. That's a photo I took. So I don't have any personal disclosures today, but I do have some, no financial disclosures, but I do have some personal disclosures today. As Jason mentioned, I'm Native American, but I don't represent all Native people. I am from one tribe of 574 federally recognized tribes, not to mention all the others that aren't recognized. Second, this talk is really close to my heart. We are not just talking about a people here, we're talking about my ancestors. And earlier, Jason actually did a wonderful academic introduction for me. But if I were to do my traditional introduction, I actually would introduce myself in my relations. So my parents, my grandparents, my ancestors. I won't go through that with you today, but I did want to introduce you to my land. So this is a photo here of Spirit Mountain. It's another photo here of it during a snowy day when I was out there for my tribal clinic. But it has cultural significance for my tribe. And a little bit more about my tribe. We're one of 9 federally recognized tribes in the state of Oregon. We're located about 90 miles southwest of Portland. This is a photo here of a Grand Ronde Health and Wellness Center where I work every Tuesday. And we are tribally operated clinic, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that means later. And then this is the longhouse that our tribe built, where we do a lot of ceremonies, a lot of gathering, a lot of healing. So our objectives today, we'll touch on identifying systems and policies that have led to health inequities experienced by Native American children. We'll understand current advocacy efforts of the Committee on Native American Child Health with specific attention to the Indian Child Welfare Act. And then lastly, we'll compare kinship care in American Indian Alaska Native communities compared to non-kinship care and the role of a healthy cultural identity. We're going to touch on some pretty difficult historical traumas today to understand these current policies that are in place. And so I just wanted to remind everyone to take care of themselves during this talk. And I'll give you a warning before we go into some of those slides too. So I've already been interchangeably using some terms throughout this talk, and so I'm going to define them here for my talk today. So there's no agreed upon definition for Indigenous people. However, I like the one by the World Bank. They write, Indigenous peoples are distinct social and cultural groups that share collective ancestral ties to the lands and natural resources where they live, occupy, or from which they have been displaced. The next term is federally recognized tribes. So that means that the federal government views these tribes as their own sovereign nations based on treaties that were signed by our ancestors. That means these tribes have the ability to govern themselves. They have the ability to determine who is a citizen of their tribe. So I'm a citizen of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. And they also, I would argue, have the right to determine how to raise their children. So the next terms are American Indian and Alaska Native. And so these are Indigenous people from the lower 48 or from the state of Alaska. And we often see these, we often see these when you have to mark your race or ethnicity. But remember, race is a social construct. And American Indian Alaska Native are actually political designations. And these are based on those treaties that were signed by our ancestors. And so people who are American Indian Alaska Native have certain rights to health care that's provided by the U.S. government. And for our talk today, they're also protected under the Indian Child Welfare Act. Lastly is the term Native American. So this is a term that kind of became popular during the 60s and 70s. It's a little more broad. Oftentimes it may encompass, along with American Alaska Native, Native Hawaiian as well. I will interchangeably use these throughout my talk today unless there is a reference that specifically talks about one or the other. And I often get the question, okay, how should I refer to you? Or the organization I'm working with. And really the answer is to ask the person that you're working with, the organization that you're working with. A lot of people will want to be referred to by their tribal affiliation. And asking them how to say it too, because many of the names that we have been given aren't our traditional names either. So how did I get into this work? It was passion, a lot of mentorship, and a little bit of luck. So passion, I grew up just off my tribal reservation in Oregon. I grew up with a single mom, and she was my native side. And she and my tribe really instilled in me this value of giving back to my community. The next was mentorship. So when I started my residency at OHSU, Dr. Ben Hoffman, who I have learned is the much older brother, Dr. Luke Hoffman here, he said to me, I know this amazing person. You really need to meet her. And he email introduced me to Dr. Shaquita Bell. And so early on in my career, I had this amazing female Native academic physician. And so her and Dr. Hoffman encouraged me to get involved in the AAP early on. And then through the Committee on Native American Child Health, or CONACH, I met some other amazing mentors, Dr. Jim Jarvis, who is now here, Dr. Jason Dean, and so I just feel incredibly lucky for that. And the luck, I have been able to meld together my passion with my scholarly work as well as my clinical work. And for that, for my department, I'm incredibly grateful to be able to do that. So a little bit more about the American Academy of Pediatrics Committee on Native American Child Health. This committee was formed in the AAP in 1965 when the first pediatricians at Indian Health Service noticed the huge disparities or health inequities for American Indian Alaska Native children that they were serving. So they went to the AAP and they formed this committee. It switched to CONACH in 1986, and actually we now have a long-standing contract with Indian Health Service to do site visits at different Indian Health Service units throughout the United States. And I'll talk a little bit more about those later. And as mentioned, I was a member from 2017 and just rolled off in 2024. Who is CONACH? It's 6 executive members. Usually these are general pediatricians or specialties who work with American Indian Alaska Native children. You may recognize some people in this photo here. This is us meeting with Congresswoman Sharice Davids, who's one of a few Native American congresspeople. But we partner with a whole bunch of other organizations. I'm not going to go through this alphabet soup. It's just to show you that we do not do this work in isolation. We do advocacy, education, policy, site consultation, and recruitment with really the mission to increase the wellness of American Indian Alaska Native children and youth. And so we go to Washington, D.C. every spring and do annual D.C. Hill visits. We meet with our state legislators, and we do this in partnership with a lot of Native American advocacy organizations, including ICWA, which is the National Indian Child Welfare Act Association. And it's important that we do this in partnership with them to make sure that we're representing the tribes and what the tribes want. We also do annual legislative briefings during that time too. We do education, and I'm just going to put a quick plug in here for the International Meeting on Indigenous Child Health. We partner with the Canadian Pediatric Society and AAP. They have a very similar committee focused on Indigenous child health. And this year it happens to be in Winnipeg, Manitoba in March. So please check that out. We also hold annual webinars, and we do presentations at AAP National Conference and Exhibition. We put out a number of policy statements. Many of the authors are here in the audience today, but caring for American Indian Alaska Native children and adolescents. We should have one coming out soon on ethical consideration on doing research with American Indian Alaska Native communities soon. But the bulk of our work is really these site consultations. We get to go to different areas of IHS and visit with the pediatricians or the providers who are doing child health care there. And we really take a strength-based approach. We identify successful programs and so that they can be disseminated out. We also identify challenges and seek innovative solutions and identify advocacy and educational opportunities as well for those webinars that we're doing and for those advocacy efforts that we have in DC. I have talked a lot about IHS or mentioned Indian Health Service, but you may not be familiar with Indian Health Service. So because of the trust responsibility that the federal government has to provide health care, they do so through Indian Health Service. It's under the Department of Health and Human Services. There are really 3 different delivery structures in place. The first is federal, and so those are federally run and operated clinics and hospitals. Those are often located on rural reservations. There also are tribally run and operated. I already kind of mentioned that my tribal clinic is tribally run and operated. And this means that the nation runs it themselves, and this is based on a lot of federal policy that happened in the 1970s. That was a movement toward Indian self-determination. And then lastly, urban programs as well. So about 3/4 of American Indian Alaska Natives live off of the reservation, often in rural areas, and this is because of forced relocations that happened, as well as a lack of economic opportunity on some tribal reservations. And so an example is the Seattle Indian Health Board here in the Seattle area. IHS is geographically broken down into 12 different areas. We're in the Portland area here, although we're in Seattle. But through CONACH, I was able to visit some truly unique, very rural clinics, and they were really doing extraordinary work with very little resources. And so many of the people I met there were so resourceful, had dedicated their entire careers to IHS, and it was truly amazing to be able to learn from them. I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the chronic underfunding of IHS while talking about this healthcare system. So this is the most publicly available data that we have for federally run and operated healthcare systems, and it is looking at per capita spending. In the blue is IHS, in the orange is the VA, and in the gray is Medicaid. And as you can see, IHS receives significantly less funding per capita. And so every year, one of the asks when we go to Washington, D.C., because we usually have a couple asks, the first one is always to increase the IHS budget. But I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the other advocacy activities that we did around ICWA. So what is ICWA, or the Indian Child Welfare Act? It is a federal law that protects American Indian and Alaska Native children and tribes from unnecessary child removal and displacement. So it was enacted in 1978 after a report that up to 1/3 of American Indian Alaska Native children were being removed from their home and placed with non-American Indian Alaska Native families. So what does ICWA do? First and foremost, ICWA respects tribal sovereignty. ICWA applies to an Indian child, which is a member of a federally recognized tribe, or a child who is eligible to be a member of a federally recognized tribes. And it governs state child welfare. So it allows tribes to govern their own child custody proceedings when a child lives on a reservation, and for parents to ask to transfer it to the court if they live off of the tribal reservation. So many tribes have their own governments, they actually have their own child protective services, and they have their own courts. However, if they don't have that available, they actually can co-manage a case with the state welfare agency and help with placements, and also help with some of culturally appropriate resources. It also establishes a minimum federal standard for the removal of children, so they can't be removed just based on poverty. And it also is this focus on prevention rather than removal. Thirdly, it allows tribes to do preferences for placements of Indian children with extended family, and then with kin within the family, and then for other tribes as well. And then lastly, it protects parents from involuntarily relinquishing their parental custody. So throughout history, there have been, I already mentioned that there were 1/3 of children being removed from homes in the 1970s, but throughout history, there have been a number of federal policies enacted to assimilate American Indian Alaska people into mainstream culture. Many of them were actually aimed at children. So this is a graphic I found on the Boarding School Healing website that shows some of these policies from the boarding school era to adoption era to the foster care era. I'll spend a little more time discussing the Indian boarding schools because this really had a devastating effect on the healthy family structures of our tribal communities, as well as our overall health. And so we're gonna talk about some difficult things now. So what are Indian boarding schools? So during this assimilation era in the late 1800s, this was a solution to deal with quote unquote the Indian problem. But really it was a genocide of our culture. The main goal of Indian boarding schools were to assimilate American and Alaska Native people. The first Indian boarding school was in Carlisle, Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania in 1879. They were exclusively for American and Alaska Native. They provided on-site or overnight lodging. They were described in records as providing formal academic or vocational training. And they, to be a federal Indian boarding school, had to receive funds from the U.S. government. The motto often was for these boarding schools was "Kill the Indian, save the man." This is a photo from Chemawa Indian Boarding School. This is a boarding school located in Salem, Oregon. It's a photo of children as they arrived, and as you can see, they are still wearing their traditional clothing. Their hair is long, and then after they've been there, their hair was cut. They were no longer allowed to wear their traditional clothing. They couldn't speak their language. They often had their names changed. And if they did practice any of their culture or spiritual practices, they were often punished. So how many children attended Indian boarding schools? There were more than 523 either government-funded, religious-funded, or private Indian boarding schools across the U.S. in the 19th and 20th century. And by 1926, it's estimated that over 80% of Indian school-age children were attending boarding schools, or 60,000 children. And to give you an idea, I went by the UW Husky Stadium, and that seats 70,000 people, so almost an entire stadium of children. And these children were often taken from their tribal communities as young as 5 years of age. So as you can imagine, that was devastating for tribes and devastating for children, because children are sacred in our communities. Children pass down our culture, our knowledge, our identity, and our traditions. Also, child rearing is often practiced in extended family structures. So it wasn't just the parents, it was the grandparents, the aunties, the uncles, the elders, the community members who lost their children. So why don't we see boarding schools today? In 1928, the Miriam report came out. This was a government report, and it cited malnourishment, poor living conditions, manual labor, and corporal punishment as having disastrous effects on the mental and physical health of children in Indian boarding schools. And in 1969, the Indian Education Kennedy report came out calling boarding schools a failure and a tragedy. And so boarding schools weren't dismantled until the 1960s and 80s. There are a handful in operation today, and I actually have a photo here of Chemawa Indian Boarding School currently. And I know I mentioned that this is a personal story, but my grandma actually attended Chemawa Indian Boarding School in the 1930s. And it is the longest running Indian boarding school, but it's really changed its mission. And I just wanted to share this photo here that they now celebrate culture at Chemawa. So we are all pediatricians and understand how adverse childhood experiences affect the health of our patients as they grow up. However, ACEs don't even begin to describe the loss of culture, the loss of identity, and the loss of those loving parental and extended family networks, our kin. However, ACEs, sorry about that. And so when you think about it, where do we all learn to parent? From our parents, from our grandparents, from our family. And so there was really this loss of parenting skills for an entire generation. I actually feel incredibly fortunate that my own mother studied early childhood development, where she learned a lot of parenting skills. But the experience of Indian boarding schools have led to historical and intergenerational trauma that we still face today. And there is a whole body of literature and research on epigenetics. I'm not going to get into that today, but know that these historical traumas have affected us at the DNA level. So A lot of us didn't learn about Indian boarding schools in our history classes, but there has been a lot more national attention on Indian boarding schools. We really rely on our Indigenous leaders with firsthand knowledge of our culture to bring attention to these things. And this is Secretary Deb Haaland. She is a citizen of the Pueblo of Laguna, and she is the Secretary of the Department of the Interior. And she commissioned an Indian boarding school initiative to learn more about Indian boarding schools. So during this time, her team reviewed 103 million pages of U.S. government records. They also did listening sessions at all the different IHS areas and talked to Indian school survivors. And during this time, her committee reached out to CONACH, and they wanted to know how did these historical traumas, how could they affect people's overall health? And so that was something that CONACH got to do and contribute to in this initiative. But the findings from this report are sobering, and I'm going to show some of the findings in the next slide. I'll let you read through them while I share a piece of artwork that I really found inspiring. So this is a piece of artwork at the Portland Art Museum, and it's by Kalia Farrell-Smith, and she is Klamath and Modoc. And she painted an Indigenous youth who has survived Indian boarding school. As you can see, their hair is cut off, which was common in Indian boarding schools. But additionally, in many Native traditions, including Klamath, you cut your hair off during mourning and grief. You also can see that this youth is crying, and they may have scars on their face. However, the bright colors and textures illuminate the vibrancy of healing through remembering. And she writes, an important step in healing is to reclaim and remember Native culture, ceremony, art, foods, language, and family. So recently in the news, just a couple months ago, the U.S. apologized for Indian boarding schools. President Joe Biden did this. This was actually the first step in 8 recommendations that the Indian Boarding School Initiative put forward. One of the other things that they had in their recommendations was to tell the story of federal Indian boarding schools to the American people and the global community, which is actually one of the reasons that I wanted to tell this story today while we're talking about ICWA. I remain somewhat hopeful that the U.S. will continue to work through some of these recommendations over the next couple years. So I mentioned earlier in the 1970s that up to a third of children were being placed in foster care. So how are we doing today? And so I pulled this data from Washington. It is looking at the number of children in foster care or entered into foster care during the year 2021, and the data is broken down by race and ethnicity. In the purple, you can see the percent of total children that each race and ethnicity represents of the total population. And the blue bars correspond to the percent of total children who entered foster care from that race or ethnicity. So on the left is American Indian Alaska Native. And so American Indian Alaska Native made up 1.3% of the total child population, but they make up 2.7% of the total number of children who entered foster care. And so they are overrepresented in foster care, and it gives them a disproportionality index of 2.1. I pulled the data for Oregon because I was also curious. And so this is the same data from 2021 in a table format. And as you can see, I circled it for Oregon. The disproportionality index is 3.3 in Oregon. So ICWA is still very much needed today. And really, ICWA is seen as the gold standard by many child advocacy groups based on the preventative services and then also based on that kinship care or that preference for kinship care. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about kinship care in American Indian Alaska Native communities. So historically, children were raised by our tribes or an extensive network of aunts, uncles, grandparents, elders, and other tribal members. Some tribes were formed into clans as well. So kinship has really been a cultural norm in Native American communities, and these relationships are still important for raising our children today. These relationships are important for passing down traditions, cultures, and also that importance of taking care of your community and keeping your community moving on. So it's really vital for the survival of tribes today. So these family structures differ from the Western nuclear family unit. So kinship care is really broken down into two types. There are formal placements and there are informal placements. So when I'm talking about ICWA, when the Child Welfare Agency is involved, that's a formal placement. But there are actually lots of informal placements. In 2022, 2.5 million children in the U.S. were in kinship care. 70% of those were in informal kinship care. So many families who are living in informal kinship care don't receive the same level of support, both financially as well as support services like parenting classes and how to deal with a child who's been through so much trauma. And so I really think that pediatricians have a big role to play here by identifying children who are in kinship care and then helping them get to resources like kinship care navigators. A lot of states through the Family First Prevention Act now have funds to be able to have kinship navigators or just culturally relevant resources that you know that are available in your clinic. So what is the research on kinship care? So unfortunately, there's not much research that has been done on American Indian Alaska Native children alone, but when we look at the overall children, there was a meta-analysis in 2014 that looked at kinship care, and it compared children in kinship care to those who were in foster care and non-kinship care. It included 71 studies and over 600,000 children. And what it found is that children in kinship care did better when it came to behavioral problems, mental health, well-being, as well as placement stability. So they stayed longer in their placements. There has been some research that has been done with American Indian children. This is qualitative research, and I'll summarize some of those findings here. But really, communities felt that due to historical trauma related to forced removal of children in recent generations, there may be a decrease of harms of historical trauma if children are placed with kin or within their tribes. There also is reduced stigma and trauma of separation from parents and family. And then lastly, this cultural connection. And I've talked a lot about the importance of passing down culture in our Native communities because culture is health. There have been numerous studies that have shown that identification with a Native cultural background and a secure sense of cultural identity is associated with higher self-esteem, better educational attainment, and it's protective against mental health problems, substance use, and other issues for adolescents and children. So I'll probably recently remember last year when there was a Supreme Court hearing. ICWA was brought forward. There was a case that they heard that claimed that ICWA was unconstitutional. And really, it was based on a couple different arguments. They argued that it's a race-based law, and so it violates the Equal Protection Clause. And as we discussed earlier today, it is not based on race. It is based on citizenship. They also claim that it commandeers state agencies and courts to enforce federal law, which is in violation of the 10th Amendment, which protects state laws. and that it improperly delegates authority to tribes to change the placement preference. But remember that tribes are sovereign nations. And so we, when it comes to law, federal, tribal, state, and we have we can govern our own tribes, and we have the right to parent and raise our own children, and that means placing them with kin. And so there was a lot of advocacy efforts during this time. There were, let's see here, I have the numbers here, 497 tribal nations, 62 Native organizations, 23 states and the District of Columbia, 87 Congress people, 27 child welfare and adoption organizations, including the AAP, and many others who signed on to 21 amicus briefs submitted to the court in favor of upholding ICWA. It was a decisive 7-2 decision to uphold ICWA, and so ICWA remains in place today based on those arguments I just went over, on the defense I just went over. When ICWA passed, or was upheld rather, there was a quote that came out from the Protect ICWA campaign, and I'm going to read it. Today's decision is a massive victory for Native children, Native families, and the future of Native peoples. The court's decision is affirmed that the Indian Child Welfare Act is constitutional, puts the best interests of Native kids first, and is grounded in tribal sovereignty. This ruling respects the work that tribal nations have done for millennia to ensure Native kids stay safe, connected to their families, communities, and cultures whenever possible. So how did AAP and CONAJ advocate during this time? So we wrote op-eds to bring attention to it. We also held educational webinars. We partnered with the Council on, oh gosh, I always get this wrong, Council on Foster Care, Adoption, and Kinship Care within the AAP. And we were also asked to contribute to an amicus brief. And many of the things that I talked about today, we included in the amicus brief. And then we did advocacy at the federal level, not for ICWA in particular because it was being heard at the Supreme Court, but we did advocacy around different programs that help support ICWA. And so we did advocacy to increase the funding for at-home visiting programs. One year, the next year, this past spring, we advocated for funding for increase the grants for tribes to work on more preventative services and to make that funding more flexible for them. And it's a photo of us from this past spring. So where do we go from here? And I really think that how we heal from all of this is through reconnecting to our culture. This is actually a photo of medical students at OHSU reconnecting to our culture. That's actually my mom in the background. She came and taught a basket making course for us. But really reclaiming our culture and our Native practices around parenting. And so I'm going to talk briefly about a program that I think is truly amazing. I had nothing to do with this program, but I got to learn about it when I went out to those different IHS sites, and many of the tribes had already had family spirit in place. But this is a home-based visiting program for young mothers, prenatally up to 3 years of age. It was actually developed with Johns Hopkins Center for Indigenous Health and 3 tribal communities. It was a community-based participatory research project where the elders really said, we need to relearn parenting skills. And so they really led the charge on what they wanted this curriculum to look like. And the curriculum includes parts of our culture, it includes storytelling, and also it's strength-based. And because of the partnership with Johns Hopkins, there have been a number of studies that have been done. There's 3 randomized control studies that have documented an increase in parenting skills, maternal outcomes, and child outcomes as well. And although it started in 3 tribal communities, it's actually spread all throughout the United States. And I'm actually really excited because my tribe just recently received a grant to do an at-home visiting program. And so we're looking into bringing family spirit out to my tribal clinic and community. As I mentioned, it's community-based. You can actually change the curriculum so that it can, because like I mentioned, not all cultures are the same across different indigenous nations, but you can change the curriculum so it really puts forward your traditions and your culture. And so I often get this question, so what can I do? I think we talked a little bit earlier about screening for kinship care, knowing about the different resources that are available for families so that you can connect them to cultural and financial resources. And then I would say just being aware of ICWA for your patients who identify as American Indian Alaska Native and advocating for them. And here are different ways to get involved. You can join the AAP. We have an Indigenous Health email group or email listserv. If you want to do the QR code there, you can sign up for that. You can attend conferences. IMICH is coming up, as I mentioned, AAP, NCE. Hopefully we have some sessions in that. You can apply for a CONACH position. So we usually have positions open every year. And then for the trainees, there's actually an email listserv specifically for American Indian Alaska Native trainees or for those who are interested in working with Native communities. And so it's copaint at md@gmail.com, and you can ask to join that as well. So, hi, Umasi. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here today for the wonderful dinner I had last night, and to all my mentors throughout the year who continue to mentor me.
Thanks. No, it's perfect. Okay, so we have a time for a few questions, and then we'll end with an honoring. So maybe 6 or 7 minutes for questions.
Okay. Well, be brave.
I have a question. Okay. Well, thank you so much. This is really great. It's great to have you here. I have a question about the tribes that aren't recognized, and how are they protected, or how do the recognized tribes try to help envelope them, or are they protected?
Yeah, that is a great question. Unfortunately, they are not protected, and so they don't receive those same services through IHS. And so a lot of them are still fighting for federal recognition. So I didn't go into this, but a lot of tribes were actually terminated in the 1950s, including my tribe. And we weren't reinstated until 1983. And so many tribes are still fighting for that right. Some of them are state recognized, and so they do receive some state services, but they don't receive health care through IHS, unfortunately. And their children aren't protected under ICWA. Thank you. Yes. So thanks.
Hello. Thank you for giving this talk. I'm just unfamiliar with how kids get removed from a family structure. Is it in a situation where there's like CPS is called, in a healthcare setting? Could you just briefly review that?
Yeah, so I would say historically there have been many efforts that were put into place. So the Adoption Act, social workers actually went onto tribal reservations, and there was bias, I would say, in the system, and they didn't understand many of our culture. There was also poverty, and so a lot of children were removed for quote-unquote neglect.
So I'm a geneticist, so you probably know where this question's going. Basically, my question is, as someone involved in genetics research, of course, clinically, I want to make sure that the population genetics research that I do is inclusive and we don't make clinical decisions about the population that exclude parts of the population. But on the other hand, I know historically genetics has been misused against First Nations people. And I'm wondering if you have context or comments or ways that we should be thinking about that I know that I'm not articulating this well, that color how we should think about genetics as researchers who want to do right, but also don't want to reduce a population just to genetic markers.
Yeah. That's a great question. I would say just remembering that race is a social construct, and really a lot of the health inequities that we see are due to racism, due to historical trauma. And so remembering that in all the research that you're doing. Yeah.
Did I miss that?
Thank you. Thanks for the talk. So you mentioned that 3/4 of Indigenous people live off the reservation, and tribal courts are kind of running the jurisdiction for ICWA. How does that work for the 3/4 of Indigenous people?
Yeah.
Say if they live in Washington and their reservation is in Wyoming, for example.
Yeah, that actually happens a lot. And so there's a couple different ways they can co-manage. So my tribe has their own child protective services or family services, what we call it in our tribe, where they will either co-manage that child welfare proceedings or our child protective proceedings, or parents can actually request, if their tribe has a court, that it be moved to that tribal court.
Thank you for this fabulous talk and wonderful work. I love what you shared about the Family Spirit Program, and I'm wondering if that only applies to children that are living on the reservations, or are there ways that families outside of a reservation setting can have access to those services? I saw Seattle Indian Health Board was on your list, and Yakima Nation, and we work close with those programs or those entities through our residency program here. And then for any of us taking care of children who are Native identified or tribal affiliated in our clinics, is there any way for families to have access to programs like that outside of living on a reservation?
So there are some family spirit programs that are not located on reservations, and I would say there's a lot of really strong urban Indian communities. I know Seattle has one. Portland is the 9th largest urban Indian population in the U.S., and so we have a really strong urban Native community there. And so there are places that they can be located that aren't on reservations. And I actually didn't know Seattle Indian. I hadn't looked at that closely. Okay, great. That's great. Yes. And actually, I'm sure Dr. Bell is very aware of that and refers families to that. Yes.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you for this wonderful talk. My question is, I think it's pretty quick. The disproportionate numbers that you showed for child protective services, like in Oregon, 3.0 time, right? That's it. Is there any data that shows that ICWA is keeping that lower than it otherwise would be, or is it? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. Like, I'm just curious, how does ICWA affect that number, or is it just after the fact that these kids are already involved in the system?
It is often after the fact, unfortunately, that they're suddenly being taken away and they're Native. We need to alert their tribe to this, unfortunately. Yeah.
Seems like a photo.
Okay. So again, a traditional way of honoring someone in Native culture. So.